And so just for the benefit of the recording, I guess, so that it's there with the recording of the webinar. Thanks again to Louisa for agreeing to share her work with us. We're really excited about this webinar, and it's been our most popular so far in terms of people who've signed up, with over 200 people registered for it. So I think it just shows what an interest there is, and sort of interesting commitment to try and improve that, and some of the issues Louisa's going to speak to today. So welcome to our speaker. For the past 12 years, Louisa has worked across women's specialist services and the homelessness sector in England. She's used this cross-sector knowledge in her current role as Housing First and Homelessness Project Manager at Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse. In this role, Louisa leads on an innovative Housing First partnership for women, and works to improve services and systems for survivors of abuse experiencing multiple disadvantage. So thank you very much, Louisa, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Fiona. Sorry for jumping in there. Hello, everyone, and thanks for turning up today. It's great to see you all in such big numbers. So my kind of experience really, well, it's very kind of frontline practice based, but I've been working at Standing Together on the Housing First and Homelessness Project and programme for the last 6 years. Just a little bit about Standing Together, first of all. So got it there. We're a national charity, and I suppose the crux of what we do, we don't do any frontline direct service provision for survivors or perpetrators. We work on bringing all the different agencies in a local area together to provide a coordinated response to domestic abuse, because we know that responding to domestic abuse is not the responsibility of one agency alone, that to keep survivors and their families safe and hold perpetrators to account, we really need to upskill services to identify domestic abuse, to respond to it, and to work together to tackle it. And we do that through something we call the coordinated community response. Oh, sorry, I've just realised I've there you go, sorry, I'll hopefully you can see that without the notes. Great. Okay, so that's just a little bit about Standing Together. And just a little bit more about kind of the housing team within which my project kind of sits within. So Standing Together, you can see the kind of circle with the little purple kind of circles around the edge. So we do a lot of different stuff at Standing Together, and we work across different areas. So criminal justice, we administrate and coordinate a lot of domestic homicide reviews, local authorities. We have a project focusing on faith and communities and the response to domestic abuse within those kind of areas. We do a lot of work with health, primary, secondary healthcare settings. Obviously, domestic abuse is a health issue. So lots of work with hospitals, with GPs, etc. Really trying to build that coordinated response. And I sit within the housing team. Now, I know obviously I'm talking today about women and multiple disadvantage. Domestic abuse is particularly relevant in women's experiences of homelessness and multiple disadvantage. And in the housing team, we really focus on that response. Housing and homelessness providers have a big role to play in addressing domestic abuse. So we deliver 3 projects that are kind of focused around this. You might have heard, and I've got links at the end, I think, to DAHA, which is the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance. We work with housing associations and local authorities to improve their response to domestic abuse. This is an accreditation scheme, kind of a gold standard around how housing providers should be responding to domestic abuse. The second project is the whole housing approach. It's a framework for addressing the housing and safety needs of survivors in a local area. So it brings together under one umbrella all the main housing tenure types alongside the housing options and support initiatives needed to help people experiencing domestic abuse to either maintain or access safe or stable housing. And then there's me. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So the Housing First and Homelessness Project supports local authorities and homelessness providers. And when I say homelessness providers, I mean predominantly charities or NGOs who provide a range of support for people who are homeless and have other interrelated needs around mental health, substance use, offending, etc. So really thinking about how they can improve their response to domestic abuse and better meet the needs of survivors who experience multiple disadvantage. So this is me, I'm the multiple disadvantage corner of our kind of housing focus. So I think it's really important to note just from the start that while we absolutely know that both women and men experience and perpetrate domestic abuse and require a response that meets their needs, we also know that it is a gendered issue with more women experiencing domestic abuse and more men perpetrating. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more later, but that's why we're talking about, well, we're talking about women and multiple disadvantage today, and domestic abuse is a key factor in women's experience of multiple disadvantage, which is why I'm sticking to that today. So just to talk about it a little bit more, so just thinking about the context. Now, multiple disadvantage is a wonderful kind of, I suppose, a theoretical construct, really. And I think it's been around, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Fiona, but an organisation called Lankerley Chase did some research a good few years back now into how people experience all these kind of different severe social issues all at the same time, how they're interrelated. It was called Hard Edges, and it kind of came up with this definition and idea of multiple disadvantage that we hadn't really had before. We tend to use complex needs, multiple and complex needs, high needs. Now, in terms of multiple disadvantage and how it's different, so the way that I think about it is how it describes multiple and severe social problems such as poor mental health, addiction, criminality, homelessness, and domestic abuse that are experienced at the same time, are co-occurring and are mutually reinforcing. It's that same time, it's that co-occurrence and what that means. Now, the other thing that makes, I think, multiple disadvantage different from complex needs or multiple and complex needs is the systemic nature of it. So we've got here the kind of little person on the path entering this just complex maze of services, and the different aspects of their experience, so domestic abuse, homelessness, addiction, mental ill health, offending, that come together. And how these needs are so complex. The systems that we have tend to be more single issue, and people are so much more complex than that. You cannot deal with somebody's domestic abuse without also in the same hand talking about their substance misuse issues and their mental health and their trauma. So it really is about taking it all together. So kind of what comes into the mix. So as well, when we're talking about multiple disadvantage being a systemic issue, not an individual issue, I think too often we blame people and we put the responsibility on individuals for their issues. But multiple disadvantage is a great term because it stresses that it is these people's individual experiences are connected to the system. So long-term experiences of poverty, deprivation, trauma, abuse and neglect intermingle with racism, sexism and homophobia. So these structural inequalities intersect in different ways, but ultimately what's coming out the bottom is a combination of experiences including homelessness, substance misuse, domestic abuse, contact with the criminal justice system and mental ill health. Now, multiple disadvantage is gendered, and there was some great research, again, done by Lankerley Chase, Heriot-Watt University, called Gender Matters a little while back. So from this original research that they did, that Lankerley Chase did back in 2015, they defined multiple disadvantage as someone experiencing homelessness, offending and substance misuse. In this research, they found that the majority of people were men. They then went back and did the research again from a gendered lens. They changed the definition of multiple disadvantage to include homelessness, substance misuse, poor mental health and experiences of violence and abuse. So in the diagram, you can see those black circles, those 4 domains of disadvantage. This change in how they defined multiple disadvantage came from a previous study where they did an extensive review of different types of data through consultations with women with multiple disadvantage and through discussions with support providers. And the definition also considered a number of other secondary domains of disadvantage, including poverty, disability, and social isolation, among others. So they used this definition to review the research, and they found that experience of multiple disadvantage is very gendered. So of the 17,000 people who experience the most severe forms of disadvantage each year, 70% are women. Now that's quite a high number. Now, when we are thinking about kind of why that is, one key thing that the research found is that the women are more likely to experience domestic violence and abuse. And they're more likely to experience domestic violence and abuse in combination with homelessness and or poor mental health. So that experience of multiple disadvantage is very gendered. Now, experience of domestic abuse is gendered. As I said earlier on, we know that women and men experience domestic abuse. It is common in, obviously, heterosexual relationships. It's also very common in LGBTQ+ relationships as well. However, to be able to identify domestic abuse properly and know how to tackle it, it is not a good approach to come to it as if it's happening to kind of women and men on an equal playing field. We know that it's gendered, and through our work on domestic homicides, that's my last point on this, we know that women are more likely to be killed or experience patterns of kind of coercion and control and the most severe violence. So an estimated 2.3 million adults aged 16 to 74 experienced domestic abuse in the last year, from the Office of National Statistics. We know that women are more likely to experience domestic abuse and men are more likely to perpetrate, although that's not always the case. So we know as well that women aged 16 to 19 years were actually more likely to be victims of domestic abuse than women aged 25 years and over as well. So youth is a factor that increases risk. And as I said, if you're a woman, you're more likely to experience that repeat pattern of coercive and controlling behaviour, and you are more likely to be killed by your partner or severely injured than if you are a man. And our statistics from domestic homicide reviews really kind of play that out. Now, there are other risk factors as well that it's important to cover. So the prevalence of domestic abuse for LGBT+ people is at least as high as for cisgender heterosexual women. Bisexual women and trans people are at particularly high risk of experiencing abuse from a partner. 80% of trans people had experienced emotional, sexual or physical abuse from a partner or ex-partner. Another Important thing to mention is women with a long-term illness or disability are more than twice as likely to be victims of domestic abuse, and they're more likely to experience abuse over a longer period of time. And we also know, when we were thinking about multiple disadvantage earlier and how sexism and racism intersect, Black and minoritized women and migrant women experience higher rates of domestic abuse-related homicide and are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than other women in the UK. So domestic abuse is very gendered, but not every woman who experiences domestic abuse will experience it in the same way, and some groups are more likely to experience it. They're going to be in it for longer. They're going to find it harder to get out of. We also know that women who faced extensive violence and abuse in childhood and adulthood are 8 times as likely to be drug dependent and twice as likely to have an alcohol problem as women who have experienced little or no abuse. Now, as well, because we're talking about the kind of different aspects of multiple disadvantage, so domestic abuse is one. Kind of substance use and mental health issues are also key aspects of multiple disadvantage for women, and so is homelessness. And I'm not going to go on about this too much, but we do know that women's homelessness is on the rise. So some research from Shelter in 2021 found that the number of women in England who are homeless and living in temporary accommodation has increased by 88%. 75,000 women and their families are homeless and living in temporary accommodation. This makes 60% of homeless adults in temporary accommodation. We also know that from the rough sleeping kind of snapshot counts that are done in autumn, 2,440 people sleeping rough in England on a single night in autumn 21, that women make up roughly 13–14% of this. Now, domestic abuse is a major route into homelessness, particularly for women. Oh, I've just realised I'm reading the wrong slide, sorry, I'm getting muddled. Domestic abuse and homelessness are really linked. Every study in the last 30 years or more has reported that women who become homeless often do so as a direct result of domestic abuse, and that while it's not always a direct cause of homelessness, experience of domestic violence and abuse is near universal among women who become homeless. There's that emphasis on survivors as well needing to flee or needing to leave to become safe, which of course is going to lead to long-term housing and economic insecurity as well. So that part of it is really, really important. So we can really see those links there between domestic abuse and homelessness. And as I've said, sorry, this is the slide I was reading earlier on, women's homelessness is on the rise as well. So we've got the figures there from kind of temporary accommodation and also from kind of the rough sleeping snapshot. I know 13–14% isn't much, and obviously women don't visibly sleep rough at the same rates as men, but visibly is the key word there, and kind of more on this to come. So what we kind of know, as I've said, experience of domestic violence and abuse is near universal among women who become homeless. I've got some references at the end, but that was from some brilliant research done by the York Centre for Social Housing Policy and St Mungo's on women's experiences of rough sleeping, a finding from that. Women are more likely to be among the hidden homeless population, so not picked up by street counts. And this is something that lots of research at the moment is starting to look at, the way that we verify rough sleepers, what counts as a bedded down contact, doesn't fit with the ways that women rough sleep. They're more likely to stay hidden. Women are also more likely to be among that sofa surfing. They will exhaust informal, unsafe kind of housing situations before they turn up to services. So yes, they're not visible to the street counts, but it doesn't mean that they're not there. We know as well that women avoid services where men are present. So day centres, things like that, mixed hostels as well can be challenging for some women, not all. And by the time there's an indication that by the time they access services, because they stay away for so long, their needs may be higher than their male counterparts. So there will be a crisis point before they do actually access any services there. Now, why is this a problem? So first of all, we don't really have the data, as I said. So we don't really know where these women are. We don't know, and if we don't know how many there are, then we don't know enough about their needs. So we know that women are present in the homeless population in much greater numbers than is generally assumed. So hiding from harm means that women are hidden from help. And if they're missing from homelessness services, they're also rendered kind of statistically invisible. There was some great research as well from the York Centre for Social Housing Policy on women's homelessness in Camden, looking at improving data strategy and outcomes, and they found that this includes different types of homelessness as well. So family homelessness is predominantly experienced by lone women parents. Single lone adult homelessness, there's been a long held assumption that this is predominantly male, but this research suggested that assumption is false. And if our responses to homelessness in England are built upon this assumption, then that's going to be a problem, because we have a lot of services, etc., processes that aren't meeting the needs of women. Also, and this is very relevant for Housing First, which I'm going to talk about later, and I know you're going to hear about in the next webinar, but recurrent or long-term homelessness, which is associated with multiple disadvantage, with high support needs around substance, alcohol misuse, mental health. There's been a long-held assumption that women don't experience this form of homelessness, and that piece of research found that's also false. So if we don't know where the women, we don't have a good idea of the number, then the services we create and commission, policy, legislation is going to be working under this false assumption that women aren't there, and services are not going to meet their needs. Stigma as well is a problem. Attitudes of professionals and services towards women who experience multiple disadvantage. I think St Mungo's are a homelessness organisation based in London and the South East, South West. They did some great research back in 2014 into women's experiences of homelessness and multiple disadvantage, called Rebuilding Shattered Lives. And I always use this quote because I think it works really well, but they found that women feel that society expects them to be feminine, to be good mothers, and to maintain a home. Much of what they experience while homeless conflicts with these expectations, and they feel judged as women because they don't meet these ideals. A perceived failure to live up to these expectations can be a really significant barrier to recovery. So attitudes and judgment from professionals and services is a huge, huge barrier for women who experience multiple disadvantage. And again, some great research, National Commission into Domestic and Sexual Abuse and Multiple Disadvantage by Ava and Agenda back in 2019, called Breaking Down the Barriers, looked at policies, services, and the poor multi-agency response to women affected by multiple disadvantage. They found that women affected by multiple disadvantage who've also experienced abuse and sexual violence face a range of challenges and engage with numerous services. Ideally, these services should collaborate, share information, and address the connections between the issues these women face. In reality, evidence shows that women are regularly let down by services, with frequent missed opportunities for support and thresholds that prevented them from accessing help. This often led to problems escalating and women reaching crisis point before they got the help they needed. And this is this theme working through this lack of that joined up response, the lack of looking at these aspects of multiple disadvantage together, and a service landscape that's built under kind of assumptions around who experiences homelessness and who experiences multiple disadvantage means that women have to reach crisis point before they get the help they need. So the Housing First and Homelessness Programme at Standing Together is working to try and address this complex problem. I think on quite a operational level, we've been trying things to kind of test and learn, trying things to see kind of how they work. One thing that we've been doing is something we call the Westminster VAWG Housing First project. VAWG stands for Violence Against Women and Girls. It is a Housing First project specifically for women. It's commissioned by Westminster Council in London, and we work on it with support provider Solace Women's Aid. Now, Housing First, I haven't put a slide in saying what Housing First is, but it's a model kind of mainly originating from the homelessness world that takes people with long-term or recurrent experiences of homelessness and who have interrelated very high needs around substances, mental health, criminality, domestic abuse, etc. So people with experiences of multiple disadvantage. And it puts them into their own independent tenancy, but provides them with the really intensive support that they're going to need to be able to maintain that tenancy and start to address kind of other issues, things that they've got going on. It's an evidence-based model. It's based on 7 principles called the Fidelity Principles. And it's something that has in England and across Europe and in the US and in Canada, evidence to work really well. I think tenancy sustainment is 70 to 90%. And these are people that, you know, would never be able to sustain a tenancy without that intensive support and the kind of philosophy that Housing First provides. So we've been trying this in Westminster for 3 years now. We've come to the end of our 3rd year. We're in our 4th year. Standing Together did the initial development of the project, and we built and maintain partnership with housing providers, and we evaluate the project as well. I'm literally working on the 3rd year evaluation as we speak. Our housing is provided by these guys, so national and local housing providers. We also have Guinness Sanctuary Housing and Salvation Army Housing Association on board as well. We just don't have their logos yet, so we've expanded, which is amazing because they provide obviously the flats for the women. The support delivery is, and I think that's what's so interesting about this project, Housing First is a homelessness initiative, and it's always been led and support delivery, I suppose, predominantly in this country led by homelessness organisations. This is a Housing First for Women, and the support is led by Solace Women's Aid, who are a specialist violence against women and girls domestic abuse charity that work across London. So in terms of the kind of the difference it makes, so we've only got data for kind of the end of year 2 at the moment, where we were supporting 20 women. We're now supporting, I think, over 30. But at the end of year 2, all 20 clients were really actively working with their Housing First support workers. And I know this doesn't seem like much, but it's actually a really big thing. A lot of these women have obviously experiences of multiple disadvantage, long histories of trauma, very little reason to trust services, having had some pretty negative interactions with services in the past, statutory and non-statutory. So that's something that I think has worked really well. And I think in terms of what has helped with that engagement, I think having that specialist women's service doing the support for this, with that specialist knowledge around domestic abuse, around violence against women and girls, around how to do safety planning, around how to talk to these women about relationships as well, has been an absolute godsend. It's just worked really, really well, having that specialist knowledge, I think, there. Now, 15 out of 16 clients had sustained their tenancies. We've got about 90% tenancy sustainment rate. As I said, in this country, it hovers at around 80 to over 90, 75 to over 90. So that's pretty good. We are seeing, you know, women who have been rough sleeping for a very long time, or they've been bouncing around all of the supported accommodation services in the borough. Seeing them actually go into a tenancy, sign a tenancy and sustain it is really quite amazing. For the first time in, you know, some of them have been homeless for over 20 years. 13 clients were supported around domestic abuse or VAWG to stay safer. Now, obviously, that's one of the key things about this service. It's a violence against women and girls. It's a women-only service. All of the women, it's part of the criteria, all of the women have to have some experience of violence against women and girls, whether that's domestic abuse, whether they're involved in sex work, they're being sexually exploited, or any other kind of gender-based violence. And they can still, another kind of key thing about the service as well is they don't have to end relationships with their partners and move on to a journey of safety and recoveries. We know that isn't realistic. Housing First, at the end of the day, is about choice and control for that person. And for a woman experiencing domestic abuse and other aspects of multiple disadvantage, who probably hasn't had any choice and control in her life ever before, it's something that is so valuable to kind of have that specialist input and support. So no one has to leave their perpetrators. It is challenging in Housing First. I'll come on to that, working with survivors who are still in relationships with perpetrators and working around that. But that's definitely something that we do, and we've done a lot of thinking about. Obviously, for women as well, it's about supporting them to re-establish relationships with family and, or crucially, children. I think all of those, out of those 20 women, well over half had children who were removed from their care, so adopted out, living with family, etc. So even supporting a woman to have letterbox contacts with her child makes such a huge difference. 7 clients were supported to access meaningful activities. So meaningful activities, I suppose, getting women integrating back into their communities a little more, joining in groups, doing activities that they want to do. It's such a huge part of building emotional safety for a woman. And obviously, you know, they've got housing, they've got that physical safety, they have a door they can close, but that is not enough for women who've experienced multiple disadvantage, long histories of trauma. Meaningful activities and engaging women kind of in things that they like to do and things that they are good at is another really important part of it. And that's one of the client's quotes. So I close the door and feel really safe and comfortable. Nobody's going to come for me in the night time. And as I said, a lot of the women on this project were rough sleeping at point of referral. So that's a huge thing. So what we've learnt, so the importance of pre-engagement work before housing, so building trust, giving choice, giving time for that pre-engagement work. The caseloads for Housing First recommended in this country are about 5 to 7 clients per worker. We insist on it being 5 with women. As I said earlier, women with multiple disadvantage and homelessness are more likely to reach crisis point before they come to services. So that's who we're dealing with. Their needs are very, very high when they come to us. So having that smaller caseload enables the workers to be able to provide that support that the women need. Housing is one of the biggest challenges for Housing First in this country. you will not be surprised to hear. Our unique arrangement with our housing providers, with our housing associations, with everybody signed up to a service level agreement and standing together, our organisation, I suppose, being that liaison between the housing provider and the support provider, monitoring the nominations, etc. That worked really, really well. And more about that in the evaluations and stuff I've linked to at the end. You can find out more about how that works. As I said, having that domestic abuse VAWG specialism just makes the world a difference. When talking about safety and relationships, establishing contact with children, obviously a multi-agency response, and the workers really working with substance misuse, with physical health, with mental health agencies to kind of broker support for women. And as I've said, doing Housing First with women is a challenge because women are more likely to experience domestic abuse. They're more likely to have perpetrators around who do sabotage tenancies and relationships. So we've actually done some great work. The Housing First workers link in with the perpetrators workers as well, linking with the professionals supporting the perpetrator, and think about it from that side as well, because obviously, you know, the survivor's the priority and their safety is the priority, but to mitigate risk to them and to keep them safe, we have to work with the perpetrator support as well and think about what's going on from that angle. So that's something that we've learned and we're working on. One other project that we do alongside Housing First is, and I know that you guys, or where you are, you're also a Changing Futures area. Westminster also has a Changing Futures project, which we support them on at Standing Together, the VAWG and Multiple Disadvantage project. Now, there are a few different things that we do on this project, but I'm just going to talk about very briefly 2 interventions that I think are quite replicable. And the first one is the VAWG and Multiple Disadvantage Forum. Now, this is a monthly forum we hold in Westminster, where professionals can bring the cases of women they're supporting for reflective discussion and practical advice around multiple disadvantage, violence, abuse, trauma, health, homelessness. Panel of experts, but with a clinical psychologist as well to hold that psychological focus. There are about 5 spaces per forum. We have about 35 minutes to discuss each case. It's a Westminster initiative, but we do discuss one pan-London case. These are our aims. So bringing professionals together, creating space for them to talk and kind of safety plan, come up with solutions to kind of issues that seem stuck. And give them time to reflect as well. So we've got a little bit on what the data tells us. So it's actually quite helpful as well to give us an idea of the kind of profile of women that are coming through the forum. I think we've had 33 cases since April 22. And I think there are a few important things there. A lot of the women are unable to access support from specialist domestic abuse agencies and IDVAs, even though pretty much nearly all of them are experiencing domestic abuse. There's a huge barrier there. We also, 12 women were sleeping rough. Half of these women wanted to be housed with their perpetrator. So this is a huge barrier as well in terms of finding appropriate support and housing options. So the forum's been really useful in unpicking and pulling out some of these gaps that exist. I'm going to send you these round, but really another important part of the forum, as well as the kind of practical advice, is supporting that worker to develop a psychological understanding as well of the woman and kind of work past these stuck issues, these things that seem stuck. And this is the kind of practical advice and things that we do as well. So linking professionals in, particularly with health and homeless health services, advice and support around MARAC and things like that. I've got to finish up now, but finally, as well as the VAWG and Multiple Disadvantage Forum, we have a strategic working group where we have taken some of the gaps identified through the operational forum, and we're currently working on 4 systems change priorities in Westminster. Improving data, housing and support for couples, particularly those where there's kind of ongoing domestic abuse. Working to kind of improve the response of the criminal justice system, and thinking about what gender-informed services look like. And this is a bit fuzzy because it's work we're taking over into our next year, it's this coming year, the project. So there's a little bit here on some of the stuff we do at Standing Together, bit on housing first, bit on some kind of tools and things we've created around women, homelessness and multiple disadvantage, and a tool about working with couples and perpetrators as well. So I will send you these, you'll have them to have a look at, and our email address is on the bottom if you would like to find out more about any of these initiatives I've talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Louisa. That was absolutely brilliant, so insightful. And I think what was really nice as well is often when we hear about women's experience of multiple disadvantage, it can be quite, well, it is hard to hear, and so we should hear it because it is hard to hear and it can be uncomfortable to hear, but that's really important to shine a light on it. But also it was nice then to hear about a lot of the work that you're doing that is making a change, and a lot that we can learn and take away from that in other areas as well. So thank you very much for that. We've had quite a lot of questions, so I'll try and get through as many as possible. But so the first couple at the same time, great minds think alike, but around everyone in, and if it had any specific impacts for women around the greater visibility, obviously, of those who were usually hidden, and then if there were any lasting effects afterwards.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm obviously coming from a very London and Westminster specifically based perspective, because that's where I was working, and I still work, and that's where I was working during Everyone In. I think Everyone In, I think provided, I mean, a good opportunity. I think it saw a lot of people come in that normally that you wouldn't have seen. I think from my perspective, working in Westminster at the time, there were obviously a few hotels, there's lots of accommodation, but I'm not sure how much planning went into thinking about the needs of women within those. I think we still had some issues around, you know, obviously if you're housing women and men straight from the streets into a hotel in a mixed environment like that without the support, because, you know, a lot of this was just food and there wasn't necessarily that key work support, there are going to be problems. There will be domestic abuse going on. There will be, you know, lots of kind of high risk scenarios. And I think that's something we found, and it was difficult to deal with, especially I think at the time, because domestic abuse, as I said, there's this gap that exists for women experiencing multiple disadvantage, sometimes struggling to access specialist VAWG and domestic abuse services because they aren't resourced to work with this group of women. They're not sufficiently resourced. The IDVAs don't have the time or capacity to be able to work flexibly enough to do it. So that was a bit of a problem. Plus, they were under a lot of stress and strain because calls to helplines and domestic abuse obviously skyrocketed during the time of lockdowns and Everyone In. So it was a bit of a perfect storm, but I think it was definitely helpful in a few of these women that would have been a bit more hidden came to the surface and helped us identify them more. But I think there was still some problems with what that support and accommodation looked like and how appropriate that was for women, I think, and how safe that was for women in some cases. That's just my perspective from the Westminster context.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really useful. So the next one is around if you know of any specific schemes out there that support women who have a mortgage but can't afford to keep the mortgage on their own, including paying out an ex. Yeah, there could be a significant amount of equity in the property.
I only know of an organisation that has done, it's domestic abuse focused, but it still might be helpful. I don't know if there are any specific kind of mortgage guidance for women, but there's an organisation called C, and I can put the link into the chat, Surviving Economic Abuse, that have done some really good work with banks, with mortgage companies, around just when perpetrators are using, male or female, are using that kind of mortgage as leverage, that kind of financial control, around what banks and mortgage companies can do better to support survivors who are in that situation. So I know that's a domestic abuse focused example rather than a women specific example. Thanks, Katie. I think you just put that in the chat. But they've got some fantastic resources around that, and they've done some really good work talking to those banks about this issue. So I think it's probably worth checking them out.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds great. The next question was around caseload size for housing support workers, but I think you covered that, didn't you, then, as you went along?
A little lower, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And the next one is around how long does the Housing First support last that is provided?
So it's open-ended. And I know that's laughable because that's not how funding and commissioning cycles work. We've been going, well, this is our 4th year, and we've still got women who were from year 1. I'm tracking them as we speak for this latest evaluation. So yeah, the idea is that it's open-ended. But Homeless Link, and I'm sure Alex will point you towards this, just did some great research and a toolkit on transitions in Housing First. So there is obviously an argument in a place that some people might get to the place where they don't need that level of support anymore. And you want to give that space to somebody else who meets the criteria and does need it. So then you're thinking about potentially graduating them down to kind of more step down, more floating support. But how that process is managed has got to be really carefully thought about, I think, because there's lots of evidence to show that people might be okay for a time until, you know, they might experience violence or abuse. There might be another incident that kind of re-triggers them, is very traumatic, and the slide down starts again. They stop opening their post, they stop paying their rent. Is all too easy to happen. So I think I'd direct you towards the Homeless Link research and toolkit on transitions around that. I think that's a really great resource. It is supposed to be open-ended, and ours is. It's there for as long as women need it.
And how does that work then with your funder? Is that just on a rolling sort of basis?
It is. Do you know what?
Really
for the last, funding wise in Westminster, Westminster Council we're really lucky to have such involved commissioners that really prioritise and get the need for the service. And I think if there's anyone out there that's, you know, wondering what that is and what their thoughts are, we're going to be doing a piece on that in the year at the end of March, talking to the commissioners about why they do it. Yeah, we're RSI funded, Rough Sleeping Initiative funded for 3 years, and that's the longest funding we've ever had. Before that, it's been year on year, and there are a lot of Housing First projects in this country that are funded by private donors, by all sorts. So yeah, we definitely need more sustainable long-term funding for Housing First. I know there's obviously the demonstration pilots across the country, of which the West Midlands is one, and they've received more funding, which is fantastic. But yeah, it is open-ended long-term support. Thank you.
That's really thorough. Another one, can you clarify how you identified those suitable or eligible for the project, and assuming that there was more demand for support than there was available?
Oh yeah, definitely Westminster as well, because it's like, well, it's got some of the highest numbers of rough sleeping in the country. Women's rough sleeping is about 16-17% in Westminster, but it's been rising. How we do it, so generally what we do at the start of the year. So the capacity for the project has increased year on year, actually. We started out with 10 back in 2019. And each year the kind of commissioners put a call out to local services, homelessness, domestic abuse and VAWG, other services for referrals. And we have a meeting with Solace to kind of discuss eligibility. So our criteria is obviously long-term recurrent homelessness. That's the target group for Housing First, really. Multiple disadvantage, and obviously some form of experience of some form of violence against women and girls, which most, if not all, women, I mean, who experience multiple disadvantage will have some experience of VAWG historically, or if not currently, or both. So that's our criteria, and it's managed through these referral meetings, but agencies can refer throughout the year, and they'll be put on a kind of waiting list until a space comes available. But yeah, as you correctly identify, spaces don't come available that often if you've got it right, because you're going to be supporting people, women who need intensive support for quite a long time.
Thank you. The next question, have family court decisions been problematic in protecting women escaping domestic abuse?
Court decisions, have they been problematic? Yes, I would say they have. I think I don't know a huge amount about this because, well, I suppose I sit on the opposite side of it with the multiple disadvantage. A lot of the women have already had their children removed from their care, generally a while ago, in that kind of really kind of high need Housing First cohort. And I mean, yeah, I mean, family court decisions, and a lot of them as well, it will have been, for a lot of them, if you look back, domestic abuse is involved in that as well. So yes, I think from my experience working on the Housing First project and developing that, if you look at the number of women who have lost their children to care, which is, as I say, is well over half. I think it's 75% of them, and the fact that domestic abuse was present in that decision, and you look at the course that their life has taken since then, yeah, I think those decisions have very much negatively impacted on them, and also on that woman's ability to engage with social care or any other services, to be honest, in a meaningful way. Again, that legacy is a long, yeah, it lasts a long time. So yeah, I can't really comment on the family court system more generally because I don't think I know enough about it. I just know enough about what that looks like, you know, 5-10 years down the line for women.
Thank you. No, we've only got a few more minutes, so we'll try and squeeze a few more questions in. I've got one here around, are visitors allowed in the Housing First properties? Is it staffed overnight, or are the properties dispersed?
So that's a really good question. They're dispersed properties, and it's their own flats. They sign an independent tenancy agreement. It's not supported housing. It's general kind of social rent tenancies. And they can have whoever they want in there, and they generally do. And that can be difficult. You know, it's hard for women who have been homeless for a long time and haven't had a door, or yeah, have been homeless for a really long time to guard their door and make decisions about who they let in and who they don't. That's a really difficult thing to do. It's a major job of the workers to try and have conversations around that and build that up, support them with Ring doorbells so they can have a look and see who it is and think about it for a split second before they let that person in. So yes, there is no visitors policy. It's the keystone of housing first of choice and control, and it's up to the women who they have in their properties.
Thank you. And the next few are comments and just emphasising how helpful the presentation's been and really useful and informative, and massive thanks for that. The slides will be shared, won't they, so we can revisit that when you receive them. Do you know, a big one to end with, do you know what the barriers are for women not being able to access services for the women that were discussed at the forum?
I think there are a few. I think, as I said earlier, there's this kind of widespread assumptions and judgments made about women who experience multiple disadvantage by statutory and non-statutory services act as a barrier. Negative past experience as well, and them not wanting to engage again. Thresholds as well are very high. I know services are stretched, so thresholds for mental health support, for a care assessment, character assessment, are really, really high, and even for women with, you know, really quite severe multiple disadvantage, there can be a real barrier to them kind of accessing that statutory support that they need. The Housing First team are great navigators and, you know, specialists in so many different areas, but they cannot replace that, you know, specialist statutory support that is needed. So I think, yeah, there are some real barriers there. So kind of falls into attitudes and judgments around this group of women, and those practical thresholds to statutory support as well, which obviously are interlinked.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we've run out of time to answer any more of the questions, but there are a few in there, so if you want to have a look after Louisa and maybe see, and also there's some really nice comments which are well deserved about how useful the presentation has been and how insightful and helpful, and presents it really clearly as well. So thank you very much. I'll just stop the recording there.